In the freezing, oxygen-starved stratosphere above the dark heart of the Third Reich, the highly decorated commanders of the German Luftwaffe were absolutely convinced they had won the aerial war. Hermann Göring, the boastful and deeply arrogant head of the German Air Force, had famously promised Adolf Hitler that not a single American bomb would ever fall on Berlin. And for a terrifying, blood-soaked period in 1943, the elite German fighter pilots were proving him right. Whenever the massive, slow-moving formations of American B-17 flying fortresses attempted to push deep into heavily defended German airspace without fighter escort, they were mercilessly slaughtered by massive swarms of heavily armed German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The German pilots cruelly laughed at the desperate American strategy. They knew with absolute mathematical certainty that the short-ranged American fighter escorts always had to turn back at the German border. They assumed the freezing skies over Berlin would remain an exclusive, highly protected Nazi hunting ground forever. But the arrogant German High Command completely failed to understand the relentless mechanical fury of the American aviation industry. Deep inside the massive factories of the United States, brilliant engineers bolted highly flammable external drop tanks beneath the silver wings of a revolutionary new fighter. The legendary, completely unstoppable North American P-51 Mustang had arrived in the European theater. When the highly confident German pilots climbed into the sky over Berlin, entirely expecting another effortless massacre of the heavy American bombers, they were shockingly met by a massive swarm of the absolute greatest, most lethal fighter planes ever constructed in human history. The arrogant Nazi hunters were about to permanently become the desperately hunted in their own skies. Before the North American P-51 Mustang arrived to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare, the massive, unescorted American B-17 bomber formations were fundamentally slow-moving, high-altitude death traps. In early 1943, the United States 8th Air Force operated under a deeply flawed, highly arrogant military doctrine. They confidently believed that massive formations of heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses could defend themselves without any fighter escort. They assumed the combined firepower of hundreds of bombers flying in a tight combat box would create an impenetrable wall of heavy machine gun fire. But when the heavy bombers attempted to push deep into Germany during the catastrophic autumn of 1943, the deeply exhausted American pilots discovered a horrific, blood-soaked reality. The elite, battle-hardened pilots of the German Luftwaffe were absolutely not intimidated by the American defensive guns. Flying highly lethal Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, the German pilots ruthlessly exposed the massive flaws in the American doctrine. The German fighters utilized devastating new head-on attack tactics, targeting the unarmored, highly vulnerable nose compartments of the bombers. They were armed with devastating 20mm cannons that completely outranged the American .50 caliber machine guns. The results for the unescorted American bomber crews were absolutely catastrophic. On a single, terrifying day over the German city of Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 massive B-17s were violently shot out of the sky. 600 highly trained American airmen were killed or captured in just a matter of hours. The traumatic sight of their battered, burning B-17 completely disintegrating mid-air became a daily, suffocating nightmare for the surviving crews. Inside the dark command bunkers of the German High Command, the arrogant Nazi generals celebrated the massive slaughter. They knew with absolute mathematical certainty that without long-range fighter escorts, the American daylight bombing campaign was permanently dead. They confidently assumed the deep, freezing skies over the heart of Germany would remain their exclusive hunting ground. The unforgiving laws of physics and aerodynamics in the early 1940s presented a massive, seemingly insurmountable wall for the United States Army Air Forces. The massive B-17 flying fortresses operated in the deep, freezing, oxygen-starved stratosphere, flying more than 5 miles above the Earth. Up there, the air is incredibly thin, the temperatures reach 50 degrees below zero, and standard aircraft engines literally choke and die from oxygen deprivation. The Americans already possessed an excellent, highly aerodynamic fighter plane called the North American P-51 Mustang. It was incredibly sleek, uniquely utilizing a revolutionary laminar flow wing design that dramatically reduced aerodynamic drag and allowed it to slice through the air with minimal resistance. But the early models were equipped with the American-made Allison V1710 engine. It was a rugged, highly dependable piece of machinery at low altitudes, excellent for supporting ground troops and executing shallow dive bombing runs. But it possessed a fatal, catastrophic flaw for the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. It was entirely crippled by a single-stage supercharger. When the early Mustangs attempted to climb into the deep, freezing stratosphere to protect the heavy bombers, the Allison engine began to desperately gasp for breath. Above 15,000 feet, the American fighter completely lost its mechanical power, its top speed, and its vital combat agility. It became heavily sluggish, unresponsive, and entirely useless against the high-altitude German interceptors that dominated the upper atmosphere. For the deeply frustrated American fighter pilots, the psychological toll of this mechanical limitation was absolutely devastating. They would fly their Allison-powered Mustangs alongside the massive B-17 formations across the English Channel, acting as an impenetrable protective shield over the water. But the moment they reached the heavily fortified borders of the Third Reich, their fuel gauges and altitude limitations dictated a cruel, unforgiving reality. They had to tip their silver wings in a grim, silent salute to the bomber crews, bank their fighters hard, and turn back towards the safety of England. They were forced to leave the heavy bombers completely exposed, watching helplessly as the pristine American aircraft flew directly into the waiting, blood-soaked jaws of the German Luftwaffe. Inside the massive, heavily protected concrete walls of the German Air Ministry in Berlin, the elite Nazi commanders felt an absolute intoxicating sense of invulnerability. Hermann Göring and his highly decorated generals understood the strict mathematical and mechanical limitations of aerial warfare. They knew that a small, highly maneuverable, single-engine fighter plane simply could not physically carry enough internal fuel to fly from England to Berlin, fight a high-intensity dogfight, and successfully return home. The laws of aviation physics entirely dictated that to carry that much heavy aviation fuel, an aircraft had to be incredibly massive, requiring 2 engines and a heavy, thick airframe. The Germans themselves possessed heavy twin-engine fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110, but these massive planes were incredibly sluggish, completely incapable of surviving a turning fight against nimble single-engine interceptors. Therefore, the arrogant German High Command concluded with absolute, unwavering certainty that a long-range, high-performance escort fighter was an engineering impossibility. They firmly believed the American daylight bombing campaign would slowly bleed out and die in the freezing skies over Germany, completely crushed by the lack of fighter protection. But the arrogant Nazi hierarchy was making a deeply fatal, empire-ending miscalculation. They completely failed to anticipate a brilliant, highly synergistic collaboration of Allied engineering that was about to permanently shatter the boundaries of aviation. The profound, world-altering mechanical breakthrough did not originate in the sprawling factories of the United States, but rather across the Atlantic, embedded deeply within the gritty, historic industrial base of Great Britain. Inside the highly secure, heavily guarded workshops of the British engineering giant Rolls-Royce, brilliant aviation engineers were intensely studying the American P-51 Mustang airframe. They instantly recognized that the sleek, incredibly aerodynamic American body was a masterpiece of aviation design, but it was being entirely held back by a mediocre engine. The British engineers proposed a radical, highly ambitious mechanical marriage. They decided to rip the gasping American Allison engine completely out of the airframe and seamlessly replace it with the absolute pinnacle of European aviation engineering, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine. This was the exact same mechanical heart that powered the legendary British Spitfire and had successfully saved London during the Battle of Britain. But unlike the American Allison, the pristine British Merlin boasted a highly complex, devastatingly efficient two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This massive, intricate piece of mechanical engineering forcefully compressed the thin, freezing air of the stratosphere, heavily feeding massive amounts of vital oxygen directly into the roaring cylinders. When the brilliant engineers finally mated the supercharged British Merlin engine to the sleek, low-drag American Mustang airframe, the resulting mechanical synergy was absolutely terrifying. Officially designated as the P-51B, it was no longer a sluggish, low-altitude interceptor. It had been entirely transformed into an absolute monster of the stratosphere. The new, heavily modified Mustang could easily soar to an astonishing 42,000 feet, completely dominating the high-altitude arena where the heavy bombers operated. It possessed a terrifying top speed of 440 miles per hour, making it significantly faster than anything currently operating in the German arsenal. The massive, roaring, Packard-built Merlin engines echoed across the English airfields, signaling the birth of the greatest fighter plane in human history. But incredible speed and terrifying high-altitude performance were entirely useless if the new American superfighter could not physically reach the dark heart of Germany. The Mustang still needed massive amounts of high-octane aviation fuel to completely shatter the German defenses over Berlin. The brilliant American engineers responded with a simple, highly innovative, and deeply devastating tactical solution. They bolted massive, highly flammable external fuel tanks, officially known as drop tanks, directly to the reinforced metal wings of the Mustang. These heavy, teardrop-shaped tanks were constructed from incredibly cheap materials, sometimes using pressed paper or lightweight aluminum, and carried up to 108 additional gallons of vital aviation fuel each. This brilliant logistical innovation completely transformed the tactical reality of the air war. The heavily loaded American Mustangs would take off from the damp English airfields, exclusively drawing their fuel from the massive external drop tanks as they slowly climbed into the freezing stratosphere. They would comfortably escort the heavy B-17 bombers across the English Channel, across the occupied coast of France, and deep into the heavily defended airspace of the Third Reich. When the terrifying, highly aggressive German fighter planes finally dropped out of the sun to intercept the bombers, the American Mustang pilots would instantly react. With the quick flip of a single mechanical switch inside the cockpit, the massive, empty external fuel tanks would be jettisoned, tumbling harmlessly away into the freezing air. The incredibly sleek, deeply menacing American P-51 Mustang was instantly, magically transformed from a heavily loaded, sluggish escort plane back into a pure, clean, and terrifyingly fast dogfighter. The arrogant German pilots, completely confident that they were about to slaughter another formation of entirely unprotected heavy bombers, were suddenly confronted by an entirely new, inescapable nightmare. The unbridgeable gap in the American armor had been completely, permanently sealed. The mighty American Mustang had finally arrived, and the arrogant hunters of the Luftwaffe were about to discover that the deep, freezing skies over Berlin no longer belonged to them. In the bitter, freezing early months of 1944, the sprawling, heavily camouflaged fighter bases of the German Luftwaffe were absolutely buzzing with a deeply intoxicating, arrogant confidence. The elite, highly decorated German fighter pilots, known respectfully as the Experten, were drinking their morning coffee and casually preparing for another routine day of mechanical slaughter. They were entirely, deeply convinced that the American daylight bombing campaign was slowly, permanently bleeding to death in the freezing skies over Europe. The massive, incredibly complex German radar networks had violently detected another massive stream of American B-17 flying fortresses heavily lumbering across the English Channel. The arrogant German squadron commanders calmly, methodically briefed their young, highly aggressive pilots on the absolute, mathematically proven tactics of bomber destruction. They completely, genuinely expected the heavy American formations to be entirely escorted by the rugged but critically short-ranged Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. The highly experienced German pilots knew exactly where the invisible, absolute boundary line was permanently drawn in the freezing sky. They knew with complete, unwavering certainty that the moment the massive American bomber streams crossed the Rhine River and pushed deep into the German homeland, the American fighter escorts would have to aggressively turn back. They would critically run out of their heavy aviation fuel, violently banking their massive fighter planes and leaving the heavy bombers completely, entirely exposed. To ruthlessly exploit this massive, predictable American vulnerability, the German High Command had aggressively ordered a highly specialized, deeply terrifying mechanical modification to their interceptors. They had heavily modified their deadly Focke-Wulf 190 fighters into incredibly massive, heavily armored flying tanks known as the Sturmbock, or battering ram. The brilliant, highly desperate German engineers had bolted incredibly thick, heavy steel plates directly onto the cockpits and the vital engine compartments of the fighter planes. They had aggressively removed the standard lightweight machine guns and violently replaced them with massive, earth-shattering 30mm Mk-108 cannons. These heavy, terrifyingly destructive aerial cannons fired explosive shells the size of glass milk bottles, completely capable of violently tearing a massive American B-17 bomber entirely in half with just 3 direct hits. But this massive, highly specialized heavy armor and the devastating oversized cannons came at a completely terrifying, highly fatal aerodynamic cost. The German Sturmbock fighters were incredibly heavy, completely sluggish, and entirely, desperately vulnerable to nimble, high-speed, single-engine enemy fighters. But the highly arrogant German commanders simply did not care about the drastic, terrifying loss of aerial maneuverability. They confidently, entirely assumed they would only be violently fighting the slow, massive, lumbering American B-17 bombers over the dark heart of Germany. As the heavy, heavily armored German fighters violently roared down the long concrete runways and aggressively climbed into the freezing, oxygen-starved stratosphere, the trap was officially set. The confident German pilots, wearing heavy, electrically heated flight suits and thick oxygen masks, aggressively climbed to 30,000 feet, violently waiting in the blinding sun. They intensely watched their fuel gauges and patiently, arrogantly waited for the massive American P-47 Thunderbolts to inevitably, predictably turn around and abandon the bombers. And right on schedule, exactly as the strict mathematical logic of the air war dictated, the massive swarms of short-ranged American fighters violently banked their wings and disappeared toward England. The heavily armored, deeply confident German pilots cruelly smiled behind their freezing oxygen masks, aggressively pushing their heavy throttles forward to violently begin the absolute slaughter. They aggressively, violently lined up their heavy, sluggish Focke-Wulfs for massive, terrifying head-on attack, runs against the completely unprotected American combat boxes. But suddenly, the heavily panicked, deeply terrified voices of the German ground radar controllers violently screamed through the static-filled radio headsets of the German pilots. The incredibly massive, highly complex German radar networks were detecting entirely impossible, completely terrifying phantom signals aggressively accompanying the heavy bombers deep into the homeland. The arrogant German pilots intensely squinted through their thick, heavily armored, bulletproof windshields, staring out into the blinding, freezing glare of the high-altitude sun. And what they violently, shockingly saw completely, permanently shattered the psychological resolve of the elite German Luftwaffe. Scattered aggressively all around the massive, heavy American bomber formations, violently sparkling in the incredibly bright sunlight like tiny silver darts, were hundreds of unidentified, completely sleek fighter planes. The highly experienced German commanders completely, genuinely could not mathematically comprehend what they were looking at. They were incredibly deep inside the borders of the Third Reich, hundreds of miles away from the absolute maximum fuel range of any known Allied fighter plane. The deeply terrified, highly confused German pilots aggressively strained their eyes, desperately trying to identify the massive, aggressive swarm of sleek silver aircraft aggressively closing the distance. They possessed an entirely unfamiliar, highly aerodynamic silhouette, utilizing a massive, highly unusual belly scoop and an incredibly sleek, teardrop-shaped glass canopy. And aggressively bolted beneath the shining silver wings of these terrifying new phantoms were massive, highly flammable external fuel tanks. The moment the highly aggressive, deeply alert American pilots spotted the massive, sluggish German interceptors heavily climbing toward the bombers, the absolute trap was violently sprung. Inside the dark, cramped cockpits of the legendary North American P-51 Mustangs, the young, heavily exhausted American pilots violently flipped the heavy release switches. Thousands of massive, heavy external drop tanks violently detached from the silver wings, heavily tumbling away into the dark, freezing abyss of the sky. Instantly, miraculously, the heavily burdened, incredibly sluggish American escort planes were violently transformed into absolute, terrifyingly fast demons of the stratosphere. The young American pilots aggressively, violently slammed their heavy throttles to the absolute maximum firewall limit. The massive, incredibly advanced British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines violently screamed with absolute, unyielding mechanical fury. The completely unstoppable, heavily armed P-51 Mustangs violently accelerated to an astonishing, terrifying 440 miles per hour. They aggressively, violently dove out of the freezing sun, completely swarming the deeply terrified, incredibly sluggish German Sturmbach fighters like a massive, angry hive of silver hornets. For the highly arrogant, heavily decorated German fighter aces, the absolute, entirely inescapable nightmare of total aerial supremacy had violently begun. the incredibly heavily armored German Focke-Wulfs, were absolutely mathematically incapable of running away or effectively outturning the incredibly nimble American Mustangs. They were violently, helplessly trapped inside flying metal coffins that had been specifically, fatally designed to fight massive, slow bombers, not the greatest fighter plane in human history. The sleek American Mustangs aggressively slipped flawlessly onto the tails of the panicking German fighters, violently unleashing an absolute, entirely inescapable hellstorm of .50 caliber machine gun fire. The heavy American armor-piercing incendiary rounds violently, effortlessly tore right through the thick, heavy German armor plates. The massive, sluggish German interceptors violently erupted into towering, roaring geysers of bright orange fire and incredibly thick, suffocating black smoke. The completely terrifying, deeply panicked screams of the highly elite German pilots violently filled the chaotic, static-laced radio frequencies of the Luftwaffe. They desperately, violently threw their incredibly heavy aircraft into violent, highly evasive maneuvers, entirely terrified of being roasted alive inside their massive steel ovens. They completely, humiliatingly abandoned their massive, heavily coordinated attack runs on the heavy American bombers, furiously, violently diving toward the ground in a desperate, entirely frantic bid for survival. The arrogant, unstoppable hunters of the Third Reich had been violently, aggressively transformed into the deeply terrified, entirely helpless prey. Hermann Göring's deeply arrogant, massively boastful promise to Adolf Hitler was violently, permanently broken in a massive, blood-soaked shower of burning German aluminum. The deep, freezing skies over the heart of Berlin absolutely no longer belonged to the invincible Nazi war machine. The absolute, terrifying era of the American P-51 Mustang had violently, aggressively begun, and the complete destruction of the German Luftwaffe was mathematically, entirely inevitable. The shocking, unprecedented arrival of the Rolls-Royce Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang had successfully stabilized the catastrophic bleeding of the American bomber fleets. But simply surviving the brutal, high-altitude gauntlet over the Third Reich was absolutely not enough to win the Second World War. To completely prepare the European continent for the massive impending amphibious invasion of D-Day, the United States military required something far more absolute. They required total, unyielding, and completely undisputed air supremacy over the entirety of Western Europe. In January 1944, a deeply legendary, highly aggressive aviation pioneer named General Jimmy Doolittle officially took command of the mighty 8th Air Force. Doolittle was a completely fearless, highly analytical combat commander who instantly recognized a massive, fatal flaw in the current American fighter doctrine. For months, the deeply frustrated American fighter pilots had been strictly ordered to remain heavily chained to the massive bomber formations. They were strictly forbidden from breaking their defensive screen, forced to passively wait for the elite German Luftwaffe to initiate the attack on their own terms. This highly defensive posture gave the arrogant German fighter aces the ultimate tactical advantage of choosing exactly when, where, and how to strike. General Doolittle, operating from his heavy command headquarters in England, made a deeply controversial, entirely history-altering tactical decision. He famously walked into an American fighter group briefing room, looked at a massive sign on the wall that read, "Our job is to protect the bombers," and ordered it torn down. He violently replaced it with a new, terrifyingly simple and absolutely ruthless directive for his Mustang pilots. "Your job is to destroy the Luftwaffe." This massive, fundamental shift in military doctrine permanently unleashed the terrifying mechanical potential of the P-51 Mustang. The highly aggressive, heavily exhausted American fighter pilots were finally unchained, absolutely free to transition from a passive shield into an entirely devastating sword. When the massive streams of B-17 flying fortresses crossed into German airspace, the Mustangs no longer patiently waited near the heavy bombers. Instead, utilizing their massive reserves of aviation fuel, massive swarms of sleek American fighters aggressively surged miles ahead of the bomber combat boxes. They actively, mercilessly hunted the heavy German interceptors as they were desperately trying to climb and assemble their battle formations in the freezing air. The American pilots caught the heavy, sluggish German Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts in their absolute most vulnerable mechanical state. They violently bounced the climbing German aircraft before they possessed the vital airspeed or the altitude required to effectively fight back or run away. But the absolute most terrifying evolution of the Doolittle Doctrine did not happen in the freezing, oxygen-starved heights of the stratosphere. It happened mere feet above the dark, muddy soil of the German homeland. General Doolittle aggressively ordered his Mustang pilots to utilize their devastating speed to violently hunt the elite German Luftwaffe exactly where they felt the safest. Right on the concrete runways of their own heavily camouflaged, heavily defended airfields. After completing their high-altitude escort duties, the young American pilots did not simply point their silver noses back toward the safety of England. Instead, they violently pushed their massive control sticks forward, dropping their screaming, heavily armed Mustangs into terrifyingly steep, high-speed dives. They plummeted from 30,000 feet all the way down to the absolute deck, violently skimming the tops of the dark German pine forests at over 400 miles per hour. The massive, roaring Packard Merlin engines violently shattered the quiet European countryside, entirely terrifying the German civilians and the ground crews. The American pilots aggressively navigated using railroad tracks and rivers, hunting for the secret, deeply hidden Luftwaffe bases completely scattered across the German landscape. When they finally spotted the massive concrete hangars and the pristine lines of parked German aircraft, the absolute mechanical slaughter violently commenced. The deeply ruthless American pilots violently squeezed their triggers, unleashing an inescapable, deafening torrent of heavy 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. 6 heavy machine guns, firing simultaneously from the wings of the Mustang, acted like an absolute massive airborne chainsaw. The incredibly thick, blinding streams of glowing red tracer rounds effortlessly, violently chewed through the parked, highly expensive German fighter planes. The highly flammable aviation fuel stored inside the pristine German aircraft violently detonated, instantly transforming the quiet airfields into massive, roaring infernos of twisted, burning aluminum. The deeply terrified, completely panicked German mechanics and ground crews desperately dove into muddy trenches, completely helpless against the absolute wrath of the American strafing runs. The heavy American bullets violently shattered the concrete runways, obliterated the heavy fuel trucks, and entirely erased the logistical backbone of the Nazi war machine. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of the low-level American hunting strategy was the terrifying concept of airfield ambushes. The highly intelligent American pilots knew that the heavy German fighters possessed incredibly limited fuel capacities, usually only enough for a single hour of intense combat. They would patiently, aggressively loiter near the German airfields, hiding in the blinding glare of the sun or completely obscured by low-hanging cloud cover. They would coldly wait for the deeply exhausted, highly stressed German pilots to return from their brutal high-altitude battles against the heavy bombers. As the heavy German aircraft desperately lowered their landing gear and deployed their wing flaps, they were completely stripped of their airspeed and maneuverability. They were mathematically entirely defenseless, completely focused on the highly delicate, incredibly dangerous task of landing a heavy, fuel-starved fighter plane. And that was exactly the blood-soaked, entirely inescapable moment the sleek American Mustangs would violently strike from the shadows. The American pilots mercilessly shot the elite German veterans directly out of the sky as they helplessly glided toward the concrete runways. The deeply arrogant, highly decorated German Expert 10, men who had survived years of brutal combat in Russia and France, were completely, unceremoniously slaughtered right over their own homes. The psychological toll on the surviving German pilots was absolutely entirely paralyzing. There was absolutely no safe sanctuary left in the entire Third Reich. They could be violently killed at 30,000 feet while hunting bombers, or entirely eradicated while simply trying to land and drink a cup of coffee. The relentless, completely inescapable pressure of the American P-51 Mustang swarm violently broke the structural spine of the German Luftwaffe. They were rapidly, catastrophically bleeding, highly trained, completely irreplaceable veteran pilots at a rate they simply could not mathematically sustain. The massive, heavily engineered German aviation factories continued to desperately produce pristine fighter planes, completely hiding their assembly lines deep inside dark mountain caves. But they had completely run out of the vital aviation fuel to fly them, and more importantly, they had entirely run out of the experienced men needed to pilot them. The arrogant Nazi empire had entirely lost control of the sky over their own capital city. The Doolittle Doctrine, executed flawlessly by the relentless mechanical fury of the P-51 Mustang, had successfully, permanently paved the blood-soaked road for the liberation of Europe. The devastating, highly methodical execution of the Doolittle Doctrine entirely broke the absolute fundamental backbone of the German Luftwaffe. By the bloody, chaotic spring of 1944, the arrogant Nazi high command was violently, permanently trapped in an inescapable mathematical nightmare. The deep, freezing skies over the Third Reich, once a highly protected, exclusive hunting ground for the elite German pilots, had become an absolute blood-soaked American shooting gallery. The pristine, highly complex German aviation factories were still desperately, frantically producing thousands of heavily armed fighter planes. But without the vital, high-octane aviation fuel to launch them, and completely lacking the highly experienced veteran pilots to fly them, the pristine machines were absolutely useless. They were entirely reduced to heavily camouflaged, incredibly expensive pieces of static metal, waiting helplessly to be completely shredded by the heavy machine guns of passing American Mustangs. Hermann Göring's deeply arrogant, massively boastful promise to Adolf Hitler had completely, catastrophically imploded in the most humiliating manner conceivable. Not only were massive, deafening formations of American B-17 flying fortresses relentlessly pulverizing the dark heart of Berlin into absolute ash and rubble, but the sleek, silver American P-51 Mustangs were confidently, aggressively roaming at completely treetop level across the German countryside, entirely unopposed. This absolute, unyielding American mastery of the European sky culminated on the dark, misty morning of June 6, 1944. The massive, terrifyingly complex Allied amphibious invasion of Europe, entirely known to history as D-Day, was violently launched against the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy. hundreds of thousands of deeply terrified, heavily loaded American infantrymen aggressively stormed out of the metal landing craft, violently charging into the freezing surf. As they desperately, violently fought their way through the bloody sand and the heavy German machine gun fire, they instinctively, fearfully looked up into the dark, overcast sky. They completely, genuinely expected to be mercilessly slaughtered from above by massive swarms of German dive bombers and heavy fighter planes. But the dark, heavy clouds over the French coastline remained entirely, completely empty of enemy aircraft. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had confidently, aggressively promised his massive invasion force a single, deeply comforting tactical reality before they boarded the ships. "If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours." The legendary American general was absolutely, mathematically correct, because the incredibly relentless, deeply exhausted American Mustang pilots had spent the previous 6 months systematically, violently butchering the German Luftwaffe. The massive, terrifying Nazi Air Force was completely, entirely incapable of launching a meaningful counterattack against the vulnerable Allied landing forces. The soft, highly exposed American infantrymen on the blood-soaked beaches of Omaha and Utah were entirely, permanently spared from the absolute horror of aerial bombardment. In the desperate, highly chaotic final months of the Second World War, the entirely broken Nazi Empire attempted one last massive technological gamble to reclaim the sky. They aggressively rushed the legendary Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter plane, into immediate, desperate combat. The German jet was incredibly heavily armed and terrifyingly fast, completely capable of flying over 500 miles per hour, easily outrunning the American P-51 Mustang in a straight line. But the highly advanced, completely revolutionary German jets were entirely too few, and they arrived far too late to mathematically alter the horrific reality of the Third Reich. The highly intelligent, deeply aggressive American Mustang pilots rapidly developed brilliant, highly ruthless new tactics to hunt the terrifying German jets. They realized the massive experimental jet engines were incredibly sluggish to accelerate, and the German planes were entirely, completely vulnerable when taking off or landing. The massive American swarms of P-51s simply aggressively circled high above the secret German jet bases, patiently, coldly, waiting for the exact moment the jets dropped their landing gear. The elite American pilots mercilessly, violently slaughtered the highly advanced German wonder weapons right over their own concrete runways. The absolute unyielding mechanical brilliance of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine perfectly mated to the sleek, completely low-drag American airframe had won the ultimate war of attrition. The terrifying, invincible German war machine had violently collided with the overwhelming, completely unstoppable industrial and aerial wrath of the United States military. Today, the dark, freezing stratosphere above the rebuilt, peaceful city of Berlin is completely silent, entirely empty of the massive, roaring bomber formations and the violent, twisting dogfights, but preserved in entirely silent museums and standing proudly as heavily polished, pristine monuments across the globe, the sleek silver airframes of the P-51 Mustangs remain. They silently stand as a permanent, incredibly stark, and deeply terrifying reminder to the entire world. A massive, permanent monument to the absolute, fatal arrogance of underestimating the relentless, blood-soaked mechanical fury and the unbreakable, savage resilience of the American combat aviator. Thank you so incredibly much for joining us on this deep, horrifying, and entirely visceral journey into the absolute darkest, most terrifying realities of aerial warfare in the freezing stratosphere. If you truly, deeply enjoyed this massive, feature-length historical dive into the brutal, oxygen-starved skies and the screaming, burning aluminum of the Second World War, you absolutely must do us a massive favor right now. Absolutely, violently destroy that like button down below until it is completely, entirely unrecognizable. It massively, aggressively feeds the heavy YouTube algorithm, entirely allowing us to continue actively producing these incredibly deep, terrifyingly detailed military documentaries for you every single week. You absolutely must hit that subscribe button right now and violently ring the notification bell, ensuring you are instantly, immediately deployed with us when our next massive historical deep dive violently goes live. We are aggressively, actively building the absolute greatest, most completely terrifying library of untold military history on this entire platform, and you absolutely cannot afford to miss a single blood-soaked episode. And before you finally, safely unbuckle your heavy parachute harness and climb out of the cramped, dark cockpit of this video, we absolutely need to hear your direct orders down in the comments section below. What highly specific, deeply terrifying military engagement, legendary forgotten weapon system, or absolute blood-soaked campaign should we violently dissect and completely uncover in our next massive episode? Should we aggressively return to the dark, heavily fortified jungles of the Pacific Theater, or violently storm the incredibly bloody, freezing trenches of the Eastern Front? Your direct, highly aggressive comments directly dictate the absolute future and the exact, precise tactical direction of this entire channel. So sound off immediately, leave your heavy mark in the section below, and let us know exactly where we should deploy our heavy armor next. Until then, always entirely respect the terrifying history, stay incredibly, deeply curious, and we will absolutely, violently see you on the next battlefield.